The Tuscany region of Italy. We spent 6 days touring around Tuscany after doing 2.5–3 days around the Rome area. I've also done a video covering tips and tricks for Rome, so check that out if you're interested in doing Rome specifically. But in this video I'll cover what we found touring around Tuscany and any of the difficulties we found and some advice to hopefully help you with your trip. So stay tuned and we'll have a look at that. We've all seen images in magazines and on TV of idyllic Tuscany. The rolling hills, vineyards, villas with lines of poplar trees and pretty hilltop villages where the pace of life has hardly changed for 100 years. That Tuscany does exist, but Tuscany is also a modern region with motorways, industrial towns, police, speed traps and high-tech parking and emissions controls. If you're travelling around, bear this in mind. Hopefully this doesn't spoil your view of Tuscany. We flew into Rome and spent 3 nights there before moving on to Tuscany. And we opted for a rental car because we wanted to tour some of the countryside between the cities. Now, I'm going to have to apologise in advance if I mispronounce some of the Italian place names. Languages were never my strong point. Rental cars. We found the big rental car companies very expensive. You can opt for a budget rental car company. They're away from the airport, but they do have shuttle buses to collect you when you phone and message them. Although people's experiences do vary, we had a great experience with the company that we used. That was Green Motion, based out of Woburn in Bedfordshire. Now, I did see reviews online from people who had tried to rent cars from budget companies, who had declined the fully inclusive insurance provided by the company and then had a bit of a struggle with their rental company. Often when I hire a car I use third-party excess insurance. It often cuts the costs quite considerably. If you watch my Iceland tips and tricks video, I talk about that in more detail. But in this case I thought it best to take the company's own insurance. It was probably marginally more expensive, but it did mean that they only gave a car a cursory inspection upon return and were very flexible when we wanted to return the car later than planned. This may be worth considering if you're going to be travelling in cities where it's quite easy to find your car picks up small dents and scratches, and a rental car company may try and charge you for all of these. Be aware that some of these budget rental companies state that they want to see an international driving permit, although we weren't actually asked for one at the rental desk, and they also want for you to download proof of your current driving record from the DVLA, a DVLA check code. You can search for that on the internet. You may not be able to take your rental car away, or you may be charged more if you don't bring these things with you. Budget rental car companies also only accept certain credit cards for security deposits, so again, check their terms and conditions carefully. Driving in Tuscany. I actually like driving in Italy. You have to be assertive on the road, but not aggressive. Drivers expect you to squeeze in, and in return you let others squeeze in front of you. So that makes life a lot easier if you're trying to pull out of difficult junctions into traffic. This is unlike Britain, where we tend to be a bit more aggressive or territorial on the road, and it's easy for us to mistake Italian driving for the same when it isn't. And once you understand that, you realise that the quality of driving in Italy is quite good. Now, despite Italy being the home of the supercar, watch out for low speed limits and speed traps. Tuscany have put in some very low speed limits on some country roads, and some of these speed limits become ridiculously slow at junctions, even where you're the one with the right of way and there's almost no crossing traffic. And yes, I have seen police hanging about at these junctions, undoubtedly ready to trap motorists. Also, watch out for snow chain regulations. You need to carry snow chains until mid-April in the hilly parts of the country. And a few years ago, they extended this requirement to the A1 Autostrada. Check with your rental company. You may be able to hire snow chains for around €7 a day, or you may be able to buy them from a petrol station. Alternatively, you could just take the risk. I don't know what the police fine is for not having them with you, but more than just the fine, we didn't want our plans to be messed up by the police, so we decided to actually rent some snow chains and have them sit in the car, even though of course we never used them. Toll roads and routes. Between Rome and Florence, you can take the A1 Autostrada, or you could take the E80 that runs along the coast, and you can drop into Porto Ercole on the way through. Both are toll roads. Or if you have the time, you can take a non-toll route, heading through the back roads through the Italian hills and visit some pretty villages on the way. This is what we did on our way up from Rome to Florence, driving in Florence and other medieval cities. Expect very tight streets and pedestrians everywhere, and assume to give them the right of way. Try to rent a very small car. A Fiat Panda is perfect, and ours also averaged 60 miles per gallon during our trip. Florence also has a complex one-way system once you're in the historic city centre, so if your hotel is in the centre, it can be quite tricky finding it. Now this brings me on to the ZTL, or Zona a Traffico Limitato, if I've pronounced it correctly. This is a camera-controlled system to reduce traffic in the centre of cities like Florence and Siena. It seems to work very well and makes these streets pedestrian-friendly and very pleasant for tourists. ZTLs have cameras on every entrance and clear warning signs. They take your car registration, so you can be fined if you enter without the correct permit, which, as a non-local, you won't have. Your car rental company will be able to pass on your details to the police or recuperate fines levied against their cars, so if you drive into these, expect to end up paying a fine later if not sooner. You therefore need to know where the ZTL is to avoid driving into it by mistake. Of course, your hotel might be inside the ZTL. If that's the case, then make sure you follow their instructions carefully and make sure that they have the ability to handle this for you when you arrive. Typically, if you park in a hotel within the ZTL, they are permitted around 3 hours from the time you pass the cameras to register your car. If you wait for longer than that, you're going to be fined. And that registration will only last for the day that you entered the ZTL. So if you park there for several days and then leave, make sure that you do not return into the ZTL on your way out. If you do so, you will need to be registered again. That means, in all likelihood, you're going to get a fine. Also bear in mind, your GPS probably won't know about the ZTL. It switches on and off at different times of the day. So that means when leaving, go straight out to the nearest main road, circle round the town if necessary, and avoid any suggestions from your GPS that you take shortcuts back through the centre of the city. If you do so, you're likely to end up driving back into the ZTL and you're going to get fined. All of this means you probably want to think carefully about whether you even bother hiring a car for the trip, or whether you would be better to use public transport. Florence. Florence is a lovely city, it's well worth a visit. Second to Rome, I would definitely visit Florence. We were very lucky to find a hotel a couple of minutes walk from the Duomo. It had a big room, it had parking, really nice hosts. This was the Hotel Dali. Now we were there in the end of March. The city was extremely busy with student parties. But by student parties I mean sort of tour groups of school kids. Now if you've watched my Rome tips and tricks video, you'll have seen that these days you can't really just turn up to somewhere and expect to pay on the spot and go into a major tourist attraction. You have to book tickets in advance. As we exit out of the Duomo one day, we passed a group of American students who were asking the guard on the entrance where they could buy tickets, and much to their dismay, he informed them that the tickets were sold out for the next 2 weeks, which is undoubtedly a lot longer than their trip. Now there are many things to see in Florence. There's some fantastic art museums which I must admit we didn't visit. One thing we wanted to do was to climb the Duomo. Now I guess that climbing the Duomo is the main attraction. Because of all the ticket combinations, you have to buy the most expensive one, the Brunelleschi pass, to get the Duomo trip. This covers the Duomo, the bell tower, the Baptistery, the museum opposite, and the Santa Reparata. I'll cover these in a minute. This ticket is €30 each. Now you must book a time slot for the Duomo climb, but everything else after that you can do at your leisure anytime you want within 3 days immediately following the Duomo visit. Because the ticket covered multiple things, we decided just to focus on the things covered by the ticket rather than going off and booking lots of other sites. We only had a few days, so we just didn't have enough time to go and visit all the museums in Florence. We booked the 8:15 AM slot for the Duomo climb. I think that's the first slot you can do, while it was quiet. And there was only a very small queue. I think this was quite a good choice. And much like I discuss in the Rome tips and tricks video, we booked everything online directly with the providers. We did not go to tour guides or these third-party websites to book these attractions. That saved us quite a lot of money, I believe. But it does mean you do have to do a bit of research in advance. You have to go onto these websites and check out how far in advance you could book them, and then be pretty early on the day, X many days in advance, in order to get the booking at the time that you want. The entrance for the climb up the Duomo is on the north side of the cathedral. You enter through ski data turnstiles. You scan the barcodes on your ticket, it moves slightly to indicate you can push through, and you just walk on through. Like many sites in Italy these days, there is security on the entrance, and they will check your bags. They will send you through a metal detector. Many Italian tourist sites have warnings about taking large backpacks. We found our 25-litre day bags were absolutely fine. No one stopped us going in, although a few places in Florence we had to store them in a locker where they had lockers on site. Now the climb up the Duomo involves over 400 steps, and it means negotiating some tight passages. Access all the way to the cupola is a bit easier than St. Peter's in Rome. If you watch my Rome tips and tricks video, you'll see what that was like. There are more passing places, but there is no elevator at all. You need to be quite fit to do this. Giotto's bell tower. This stands right next to the cathedral, although it's actually slightly separated from it. Climbing the bell tower is included in the price of the Brunelleschi pass. After walking back down the 400 steps from the Duomo, we were feeling slightly mad and just went straight to the entrance to the bell tower and climbed back up another 400 steps to the top of that. I did feel that passing other people on the stairs was more awkward in the bell tower than it was in the Duomo. If you're not particularly fit, or if you're quite large, then consider just doing the Duomo out of the two, since the view is pretty much the same, but with the disadvantage in the bell tower that the cage on the tower can make photography more difficult. The Opera Museum. This is on the east side of the piazza that contains the cathedral. It's covered in the Brunelleschi pass. Since it's covered in a pass, so you've already paid for it, it's definitely worth doing. It's actually quite a quiet museum. Not many people seem to bother with it, and it has great exhibits, so it's very well worth a visit. You can't take backpacks in, but they have a baggage check on the entrance so they can be securely stored. The Baptistery. This is the octagonal building at the western end of the cathedral. It's pretty small, but it has the advantage there are no steps or narrow corridors to negotiate. Since there's no queue to get in there, and it is included in the Brunelleschi Pass, you might as well pop in for a look. Note that as of spring 2023, the ceiling is being worked on, so it's not actually visible. Santa Reparata. This is the crypt underneath the cathedral. You can see ruins going back to Roman times. If you have a Brunelleschi pass or any of the passes that they sell, it covers this. So don't bother queuing in the long queue that gives you free access to the cathedral floor. There's a short queue for the Santa Reparata on the south side of the cathedral, but once you've entered, you'll find that you're actually in the main body of the cathedral, so you can go and tour the whole of the cathedral, having cut out the huge queue on the western main entrance. Once you've toured around the main body of the cathedral, you can go down the steps into the crypt, and at that point they will check your tickets again to make sure you have access. If you've got time and you don't want to buy one of the passes to go up the Duomo, for example, you can get free entry to the cathedral. It's a church after all. The only problem there is that you have to queue, and the queue can be exceedingly long. My advice is to try popping around there for multiple times and have a look. We noticed that the queue was quite short at about 4 p.m, but other times it was exceedingly long, and people could have, I guess, spent an hour or so just standing in that queue. The main body of the city is on the north side of the River Arno. If you want to cross to the south side, then a nice way to do it is across the Ponte Vecchio bridge. This is a famous bridge from the Middle Ages, which still has buildings and shops covering either side of the bridge. It's very historic, everyone's seen pictures of it. One of the reasons for crossing the bridge to the south side of the river is to visit the Petty Palace. This, I'm told, is a fantastic art museum. If you want to walk and see the views, you don't need to pay to do the art museum. You can pay a bit less and you can do the gardens. The Petty Palace is attached to the Boboli Gardens. A full ticket for the palace and gardens is €16, but for €10 you can just visit the gardens on their own. The ticket office is actually to your right as you walk towards the entrance to the Petty Palace. Once you've got your ticket, we found there was no queue to get into the Petty Palace, but you do need to go through security checks, both for the garden and for the Petty Palace. I will admit I was a bit underwhelmed by the Boboli Gardens, but if you climb to the top you can visit the Belvedere Fort. There's an exit near the fort entrance, although unfortunately it was closed when we were there. When open you should be able to walk the walls for free, but the museum itself is €10. Now if you do buy the ticket to the Boboli Gardens, it also entitles you to enter Villa Bardini. Now this is part way down the hill. As you pass the Belvedere Fort and then go down the hill, there's an entrance on your right. Crossing back to the north side of the river, the Galileo Museum is a great museum full of interesting historic scientific instruments, and it's only €8 per person. We didn't book, and because we turned up early there was almost no queue. You do have to put your backpacks in lockers, but they are free. Of course, there are many other fantastic sights to see in Florence. We just didn't have time to see them all. One recommended one is the Uffizi Gallery. If you're interested, it's €12, and the ticket also gives you access to the National Archaeological Museum, also to the Museum of the Opificio delle Pietre Dure, if I've pronounced that correctly. Note though that these museums don't allow you to use selfie sticks or flashes, but they do allow photography. The same restriction applies to the Galileo Museum. Pisa. Now I suspect most people visiting Florence will fly in via the airport in Pisa. The question is it worth visiting Pisa itself and its famous Leaning Tower? Now I'm not convinced I would make a special trip to it, having driven there myself. It is an underwhelming and fading industrial town in my view. Usefully, there's a free car park about 15 minutes walk from the tower. It has toilets for €1. You can also take a tourist train to near the tower entrance, although I don't know if there's a charge for that or not. The queues for the tower and other tourist attractions were short compared to Florence, although we didn't bother going in any of them. And whereas Florence is in the beautiful hills of that part of Tuscany, as you leave Florence and head towards Pisa, the countryside soon flattens out and becomes less interesting. San Gimignano. This is a stunning hilltop village with square section towers ranging across it. There are some official car parks, but I found a small free car park partway down the hill. It has lots of nice shops and restaurants and galleries. There's an interesting shop, an information centre which has a large-scale model of the village, and it shows it how it would have looked when all the towers were present, as many of them no longer exist. It would have been spectacular at the time. After leaving San Gimignano, we headed off and found a dirt road that led through the vineyards. It was a beautiful drive through the countryside. Monteriggioni was another place that we wanted to visit. Its main feature is its castle-style fortified walls that surround the village. However, once inside the village, I didn't find much worth seeing, certainly compared to San Gimignano. If you want to visit, there are a couple of paid car parks below the village. The village also probably looks best from a distance, where it looks like a castle up on a hill. The only thing is, driving to and from it, there wasn't really an easy vantage point we could find where we could just stop the car and take such a picture. Siena is awkwardly built onto an oddly shaped hill. It's a town of two halves. One half is very quiet lanes with historic residences towering over them, but hardly a shop or a cafe in sight. There's also hardly a person in sight. The other half is dominated by the piazza, where the annual horse race takes place. That half is full of bars and restaurants. It's a lot more touristy. Sadly, it seems that the bars and restaurants around the piazza seem to specialise in selling alcohol to young people until about 7 p.m. We had an early pizza dinner in one of these and it wasn't particularly good, neither was the service. I suspect it's best to wait until later in the day and eat at one of the proper restaurants tucked away further into the back streets. Siena also has the dreaded ZTL, so avoid driving through it, and if you're driving to your hotel, ensure you know the route that they provide, avoiding accidentally going into the ZTL. Other places to visit on the way through. We stopped at Sutri for breakfast, about 30 miles north of Rome. There are a number of villages like this that are worth checking out on your travels if you have time. Sutri is built up on a rocky hill and has historic cave dwellings below. A must-see village, in my opinion, is Bagnoregio. It's halfway between Rome and Florence. It's a small town with narrow streets and probably interesting in its own right. But what makes it worth a visit is the historic village at the far end on a high rocky outcrop reached by a causeway. Okay, there isn't a great deal to see there, but it is a wonderful little place. You have to pay a charge to visit. There's a ticket office just below the causeway. We initially drove down all the way to the bottom of the hill and parked below that ticket office, before noticing that all the cars appeared to have residents' parking permits on their windscreens. We figured this might not be the tourist car park and that we might get fined for parking there. I still don't know for sure, but we found a small car park back at the top of the hill, which you have to pay for. But the walk from there offered a wonderful view of this fortified village. So if I were to do the trip again, what would I do? I'd be tempted to do a 2-center holiday. Rather than visit things like Pisa and some of the other places, maybe just focus on spending 4 days staying in the centre of Florence, enough time to see some more of the museums and galleries, see some of the stuff that we missed. Maybe combine that with several other days in a villa in the traditional Tuscan countryside, just to experience the peace, quiet and beauty and the classic Tuscan views. Anyway, whatever you do, I hope you have a great trip. Okay, thanks for watching. See you next time, guys.